Hello and welcome to episode 55 of the Freo Big Footy podcast. This week we'll be going to have a look back at the game versus Sydney in the Land Hall Classic, where once again Freo turned up for the first half and sort of fell asleep a bit in the second half before kicking on to record their best ever start to a season. And then we'll have a look at the upcoming clash against Melbourne, which has sort of taken on a new perspective after their terrific win against Richmond on Friday night. Joining us is our usual residential Victorian expert, Seppo. How are you, mate?
I am very good and glad to be sitting 4 in zip. It's what a start to a year, and just makes me excited to get into the next week of footy.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, at the end of the game, it was Fremantle 11 goals, 874 to Sydney Swans 8 goals, 1260. And as we just talked about a little bit earlier, Seppo, it's definitely a game of two halves. And Fremantle once again showed in the first half some outstanding football, but unfortunately fell asleep again in the third quarter, where Sydney were able to sort of get back on top in the clearances and in the centre and just looked a lot stronger. But once again, we were able to steady a bit more in the last, which was pleasing, and then sort of ended up getting away with the victory.
I suppose the difference between this little fall asleep is that the Sydney are a good side and they pressed us hard, and we got hit in that third quarter. And I just heard Ross recently on the footy show, I think, mention that he was actually thought it was a pretty good 3 quarters of footy, and it was just that third one. So it was very good leadership in the last to sort of hold off that fight that Sydney put in. But what went wrong in that third, I watched the replay already and just trying to work it out. It's a bit hard to see, other than the fact that the Sydney players are pretty classy and sort of exposed us with a couple of matchups around the ground. And certainly some players seemed a bit down on form, and it probably the likes of Barlow and Neil were probably down on their normal output.
No, absolutely. And I think that was probably the biggest thing to come from the game, particularly in the first half when the heat was on, Seppo, was not the fact that obviously we did play well, but it was more of our lesser lights that were the guys that were leading the way, and in particular De Boer. And I know Subban's caught plenty of stick on the forums, but even he was in and under and quite hard at it. I mean, Fife continued his pretty sensational start to the year, but it was just more of those lesser lights. Spur in the back line once again was very strong. Ibbotson, there was just those sort of, rather than being our normal sort of guys leading the way, it was sort of more of those lesser lights, even Clancy Pearce.
I suppose that's the big thing about all those players you just mentioned. I just watching that last quarter to see crucial spoils and intercept marks from the likes of De Boer, Subban, Clancy Pearce, Mzungu, and Ibbotson with that last one that set up Main's goal. He probably won't be recognised for that on the stat sheet, but that was certainly his goal, because Sydney were probably out again then, and just to ice the game with Mainie's kick on goal, it was just brilliant from Mzungu. Not Mzungu. Mzungu did something earlier, but Ibbotson was brilliant to cut that off. And it's one of those things when you watch the replay, he looks a mile off the contest, and how quickly he got into close off and just put a little fist in. And there was a couple around the ground as well where De Boer and Subban and Clancy were just flying in recklessly, just trying to get a hand on the ball and kill the contest, because Sydney certainly looked good and they're array at stages, but the way we sort of did a team defence approach and guys knew when to go, you certainly can't back out of the contest like some other clubs are, and other games I've watched, they're certainly not to that level of intensity and team defence.
Yeah, it was interesting. The other thing I think, Seppo, as well, was the way that Fremantle used their loose man. Like, obviously, there's been a bit of talk about it this year, and obviously they changed it up a little bit in the third quarter, and even like when guys like Lachie Neale, he seemed to be playing on McVeigh quite a bit early in the early game. Even when the they were getting on top of us in the clearances in that third quarter, they still kept Lachie Neale out of that centre square thing. So it was interesting to see whether they were just trying to push it differently or go for a different look. But it was just different. So just the way whether they had that extra loose man at the contents rather than the extra man down back. Just a couple of things they tried in that third quarter didn't seem to pay off very well. Even having the I know we use the third man up quite regularly, but we never seem to do it very well. Every time we've tried to use it, we seem to either tap it directly to their player or we never get the clearance.
Well, I suppose it's looking at the going back on Neil's influence and Barlow being down. I've just had a look at their time on ground percentages, and it's way down on their usual. Barlow's 69% time on ground, and Lachie Neale was 73. So I reckon if there's guys going in with a bit of, I think it mentioned of a head cold or something like that, that those players were down, and certainly had that effect in the contested possessions and even just the clearances. It's one thing we usually dominate, but Sydney got on top of us there with 38 clearances to 29, and even though Sandilands did dominate, it didn't seem like that true midfield unit that was just dominating right the way through the earlier rounds.
Yeah, I mean, even as you said, talking about Barlow and Neal and that sort of thing, the interesting thing was, even in that case, was the fact that they had, they used 59 interchanges up to half time, but actually only still ended up on 105, I think, for the game. So they probably didn't use, and I think Sydney were up to about 115. So we're 15 interchanges short. Now, normally, in our normal sort of game routine, Ross is pretty adamant about going right up to, the 120, 119 mark. So I wonder if it was just they kept them out there so they didn't have to run back and forth to the bench as much, or they rotated them through different sections of the ground rather than sort of rotating through the bench. So, because it's very unusual for Fremantle not to use their full allocation of interchanges.
Mm.
Obviously, probably one of the standouts, I think, for the game, obviously, was the clash between Franklin and McFarlane. And obviously, McFarlane definitely had the wood on him early and obviously played pretty well on him all game, where but I think Ross was pretty sort of clear on it early in the game when we were making it difficult for Sydney to bring the ball in. Obviously made it much easier for Luke and the defence, but in that third quarter, particularly when they moved Reid up the ground, we just struggled with that matchup and also allowing them to have too much easy ball going into the forward line, and they lowered their eyes a bit and got a lot more easier shots for goal.
It was one thing I talked about last week with Silvani not being out there to curtail the influence of Franklin, that I did worry that the combination of Franklin and Tippett might push the balance in there, because I don't like sort of Johnson and McFarlane constantly having to take two big units, and I suppose they are two of the... And Tippett's huge in the upper body, and even Johnson was tight checking him. He still managed to get some marks away, and both Tippett and Buddy ended up kicking 2-2 each. But I suppose McFarlane did the great job of running around with Buddy all day and making it really hard for him, not just giving easy ones, and let him go if he goes up the ground, because I noticed Buddy did try and have a bit of an influence up the ground and McFarlane sort of stayed deep. But it was good to see that they at least didn't rip us apart and kicked 4 each or anything like that. So it's great to see that those two can do it, but it'll be great when combination of Silvani, Dawson, and even Alex Pearce, once he starts to develop, and we can get some other sides that don't have good two big power forwards like that we can start to share the load, because you don't want McFarlane doing that for 22 rounds.
No, absolutely not. And I think, as you said, they'll probably try and get as many wins in the bank early. I mean, I know when, looking a long way ahead, Seppo, they've obviously got a little bit of an easier draw come, I think, between round 16 and 20. So hopefully by then they'll be able to sort of rest a couple of those blokes and see how they're going. But, as I said, I think it's one of those opportunities where Fremantle will obviously try and rotate guys where they can, but at the same time, at the moment, it's pretty tough for spots. And when you look at the guys who are trying to get in, you've got Ballantyne, Sheridan, Crozier, and then obviously guys like Dawson and Silvani also waiting in the wing. So the list is in pretty good shape at the minute.
And it's a good thing about the game, that we used a sub to pull off Taberner, and we didn't pick up any major injuries other than, the usual little rolled ankles here and there and guys stretching out their calves on the sideline. That we've been quite lucky that the only injury we've really picked up since the start of the year has been Sheridan with his hamstring or quad strain, whatever it was. That we've actually been very lucky, considering all other sides and the big long-term injuries they've been adding to their list. We actually got out of this hard-fought contest pretty much well unscathed, and it certainly makes the pressure for spots increased, and no one's sort of gifted a game, and you got the likes of Ballantyne to bring back into the side next week. It becomes quite hard.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that, even when you look at the game itself, as you said, with Sheridan with his calf, but the interesting thing was when you look at the Fremantle side, probably out of our top sort of possession getters, really, like Lee Spur was up there with 21, Clancy played a defensive role at 20, Johnson had 18, Ibbotson had 18, and McFarlane was up there with 16. So out of our top 10 players, 4 or 5 of them were defenders. So I think it showed that we probably had quite a bit of improvement left, but it showed that Sydney did a really good job of shutting down the outside run of Pearson and Hill in particular. Even though they did get a bit of the ball, they weren't as damaging, obviously, especially, last week was a bit of an aberration, but even the week before against Geelong, they sort of where they were able to run a bit more freer. They certainly did a good job of shutting them down. And the fact is we were still able to get the points, which was really pleasing.
And I suppose this is the one thing that we've had in the last couple of weeks that Sydney managed to shut down is both, well, all three of Walters, Hill, and Daniel Pearce, none got on the scoreboard with a goal. So that was usually where a lot of our drive and goal kicking was coming from in previous weeks. But I don't know if it's positioning or just the way we structured up. But those three would have been handy for probably 3 goals amongst the three of them, but didn't seem to find it, and that sort of led to that lower scoring game with 74 points scored in total. But Sydney definitely were a worthy opponent, and they did try really hard, and it's good to know that we can match it with the best of them, and it wasn't just an aberration. These first of the 3 games, beating Port, Geelong, Eagles, and now we're sort of validated with a big win against another undefeated side. And now, depending on the other results going forward, if we can stay up there and stick top 2, we're going to be in a very good position.
Yeah, I think at the start of the year, when we looked at the draw, I think most Fremantle fans would have probably been reasonably happy if it was maybe 2-2, optimistically 3-1. But 4-0 was definitely a terrific result. And as you said, it gives us a platform to set up the rest of the year. But it's important that we don't just sort of rest on the laurels and we keep going, because we do have even now a couple of tough games coming up. We always seem to struggle with Essendon at home for some reason, and but if we can sort of, as you said, keep those top 2 hopes alive, it will certainly make it important for us if we want to be any chance of making the GF. I think being in that top 2, even though we've shown we can win on the road, having those top 2 games at home just makes all the difference. All right, any other points you want to bring up, Seppo, on this one?
Not from that game, other than the fact that it's going to be quite interesting if Fife gets the 3 Brownlow votes again, because certainly might get it in the coaches' votes, and maybe some of the Sydney players like Hanbury or Jack or Lloyd, some of those other guys might squeeze in there with a vote or 2. But I think Fife is certainly best of field in terms of a visual from an umpire's probably watching what he did on the ground. But who would you do as your 3-2-1 votes? Because I had down probably 3 for Fife, 2 for probably Hill, maybe Ibbotson, and then 1 for probably Hanbury.
Yeah, I thought Hanbury was probably their best player. I mean, Sam Reid was very good in the second half, but it was just, but his first half was pretty abysmal. So I think, as you said, Fife was certainly more the standout player. I mean, important tackles and stuff in close. As you said, you had guys like the ball, but once again, and those sort of guys, but they just didn't play that 4 quarters. I thought McFarlane would probably get a vote. I thought he'd certainly do well in the he'll certainly do well in the best and fairest, if not the Brownlow.
Yeah.
I don't think Hills probably did enough. I was quite a big fan of Spurs game. I thought he played very, very well. But once again, it's very unusual for those sort of defenders to get Brownlow votes, And as you said, Ibbotson was another sort of standout player. It was an interesting matchup when they had Kennedy and Fife going head-to-head, and the way they played each other. And, it'll be interesting to see how the Brownlow votes go on that night, because no one really stood out for 4 quarters consistently, I thought. So, being those game of 2 halves, and as you said earlier, Seppo, when you're playing a team like Sydney, you knew they were always going to come back, and they weren't going to lay over for the whole 4 quarters. So it was just the way we were going to respond, and probably Lyon wouldn't be happy with the fact that it took us a whole quarter and that 3-quarter time break to be able to sort of wrestle the momentum back a little bit. And even probably the start of the 4th quarter, Sydney still had it there for probably another 5-10 minutes at the start of the 4th. So he'll certainly have things to work on, and I think at the moment his adage was pretty accurate. We're probably not a juggernaut team, but we are certainly hard working, and I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement to come.
Yeah, I suppose that's one thing we've seen. We've got 4 wins, but we haven't seen a proper 4-quarter performance yet. So I suppose the best probably would have been Geelong, but even then I don't think it was a full 4-quarter performance. So it'd be great to see finally this week, when we're looking at coming over to play Melbourne at the MCG on a big stage and a proving side, that we probably string a 4-quarter performance together to really just push ourselves in the right direction and improve on last week. It's probably not good enough just getting a win now. We've got to make sure that we can do a 4-quarter performance and let the players improve, or it's probably the stage you can start dropping people on performance if they're starting to let down, to get some changes into the side and get some different people out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, but that's the thing, as you said, people, it's so hard to get in the side now that no one will want to get themselves dropped. I mean, even like, it was interesting to see Lyon's comments on Sheridan last night as well. Like, he was quite obviously keen for him to get back in. And, he played exceptionally well in the first game, but coming back off his calf injury, it's now going to be hard to push it in like Mzungu's effort last night in the last quarter as the sub was,
Enough to warrant a full game
sensational.
now.
So
Yeah.
he'll certainly be pushing for a top, for starting 21 spot as well. So just no one can afford to take time off, and even like guys like De Boer, you could just sort of see he was playing for his spot in the 22 and was just desperate all day. So I mean, it's a great place for the match committee to be in, but it's also going to be tough to keep all those players happy at the same time.
Mm.
All right. Well, we haven't got the ins and outs this week because unfortunately, fortunately for me, but unfortunately for others, I've got to travel and I'm going away for the week. So we did the podcast a little bit early this week. And thanks, Seppo, for coming on board, doing it a bit earlier. But we obviously got a chance to have a look at Melbourne on Friday night, and they pretty strong performance there against the Tigers, and Tigers would be obviously bitterly disappointed with that performance. Obviously, Seppo, we don't know the ins and outs, but you'd have to think Ballantyne would come straight back into the side. So looking at that just on its own, most people on the board seem to think that De Boer will be the player out. Who do you think will be the ins and outs for this week?
Yeah, it's certainly hard to do it on performance, and you think structurally they subbed off Taberner, but against Melbourne, I'm not sure if they just want to expose him again. It is probably an option to go Taberner for Ballas and keep ourselves a bit shorter, but I suppose it all depends on what they want to go with. If it's just the one change, they might look at two, and if there's players that are still carrying a bit of sickness, or I'm not sure if Neil or Barlow would probably want to be dropped if they're not 100%, because once they lose that spot, it's going to be hard to come back in. But it's very hard to find a natural replacement to get Ballas into the side, because the guys on the periphery or the lower end of the skill list of the best 22 are actually playing decent games, so it's hard to justify dropping Subin or Pearce after the great games they've had. And for the balance, it doesn't make a lot of sense to drop some others to get Ballantyne in. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if it's just the one change, but it might be someone like Taberner or I suppose De Boer to get them out. He's been so good for what he's done so far.
I think that was probably the game last night where Ballantyne would have done something a little bit, even in that third quarter or even the last quarter, where he just manages to do something and bring the crowd into it or just break it open a little bit. And I think that's where his value is, just that extra pressure tackling as well. And you'd have to think there's no way that he's not going to be coming straight back into the side. So it'll be definitely someone who's probably played a pretty good game is going to miss out, unfortunately. And but you just have to play him. And I think particularly at the MCG, I think it's important that Ballantyne does play. Even though he hasn't, he played a cracking game there last year against Richmond. And I think he got 6 goals there last year. And after all the talk about his grand final performance, but I think it's important, and he's definitely in our best 22, so he has to come straight back in.
Yes.
All right. What impressed you about the Melbourne side on the Friday night, Seppo?
Well, some of the younger guys or new guys that they've got out there now starting to set up with Aaron Vandenberg and our old mate Jesse Hogan. So they are likely types that are starting to improve, and really probably those type of people are the whole improvement to Melbourne's list this year, and that's why they're a better team, because certainly Jamar's a good ruckman, will be a good challenge for Sandilands, but midfield matchup would have them covered there. But the guys like Howe and Hogan are pretty good in the air, and we'll actually see some good matchups with them. But I think our midfield will be too dominant for them. But it's good to see that Melbourne have improved, and we won't call this a walkover. And they'll put up a bit of a fight, but not as much as Sydney have, I suppose.
Yeah, as you said, Melbourne, I think, are heading in the right direction, and I think if they had Jack Viney in this week as well, I think he's still going to be a big loss for them, particularly against the bigger midfielders that we have. So it would have been definitely a loss for those guys. But you can start to see a bit of glimmer of sunshine for those Melbourne supporters. You can, like as you said, Hogan just looks a beast, and obviously when he was over here playing for Claremont in the Waffle, you saw that same sort of attributes that he showed on Friday night when he was playing for Claremont. Loves hitting the pack and take a pack mark, and one thing that was interesting even on Friday night, particularly even in the wet, Seppo, was the fact that when he was probably a colt at waffle level, his kicking wasn't terrific, but he managed to slot them through on Friday night, and even a couple on hard on the boundary. So it certainly won't be a game that Fremantle would be wanting to take lightly, and obviously Melbourne will be up and about, and the supporters will probably be a little bit happier as well after the a couple of years, few years in the doldrums. It's at least it's looking up for them, and they look like by come the end of the year they'll have this sort of semblance of a good side, particularly when you've got Petrarca to come back in next year as well.
That's true. So would you read more into the fact that Melbourne have improved or Richmond have really tailed off? Because I think watching that game earlier, they've certainly got some guys that are well down on form, and they did win the clearances by a fair margin against the Ds, but some of the guys have just had shockers, and you can't afford to have Cochin and Martin sort of pull them over the line every week, and their depth, I suppose, is being exposed. And I suppose they did lose a couple of people to injury out there, but it was really showing that Richmond's probably gone back on last year, and they were just lucky to get a big win against Brisbane the week before. That Melbourne have improved and Richmond haven't.
Yeah, I think they always seem to struggle when Delidio doesn't play Richmond for whatever reason, and as you said, I don't think and Richmond, occasionally you can do all right when you take other clubs' sort of, fringe players, and Richmond actually have quite a lot of them. And I know we've got a lot of mature ages in there, and I know Sydney have also got them, but they seem to meld in pretty well. But Richmond have got, they picked up Taylor Hunt this year, but they also have the likes of Chaplin, that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to, see in the next couple of weeks how that form line holds up. So, but I think it's a bit of both. I think Richmond weren't probably, once the rain came down, weren't hard enough, and I think Melbourne just were a bit more desperate. And particularly when you're playing wet weather footy, I think it shows out, and I think they definitely deserve the win. And it'll be interesting to see how they go this week against the Fremantle side, who'll be looking to make it 5 in a row.
Mm.
Any sort of matchups stand out for you this week?
It'd be interesting just to see if we go with sort of any hard tags, or if they use Vince to run with, I suppose, Hill, or maybe some outside runners that they think is damaging enough. I know we've pretty much left Nathan Jones unchecked most times, but now they've got some other guys that start to run through there that are not. Dom Tyson's a likely type in the midfield, and I can't remember else who runs through the midfield much. Daniel Cross is probably more of an outsider, but there's no sort of main matchups that you'd want someone running with. Dom Tyson's probably one of their talented types that gets a lot of the footy and plays well, but even the old Harry Lumumba and some of the other guys that play sort of on the outside and running, Neville Jetta, probably don't need to worry about them too much. And they've obviously going to have one change with Dean Kent going down with that hamstring injury, but it's not exciting really in terms of matchups, I suppose, until you actually see the teams named and lining up on the game day. But it's no matchups are really standing up as well.
It'll be interesting to see how who. Obviously, in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of talk about the way Melbourne have using Bernie Vince, in particular in the tagging role. And obviously, he played on Trent Cotchin on the weekend and kept him pretty quiet, particularly in that second quarter. And even though I know they moved Cotchin forward, but he certainly did a good job on Dangerfield the week before. So it'll be interesting to see whether they run Vince with Fife or whether they choose to run Vince with someone else, because they don't generally play with a lot of taggers. And as you said, some of their newer improvers in there, like as you said, Nathan Jones has been a staple, but I was pretty impressed with Vandenberg on Friday night. And Newton showed a bit even in the pre-season game here, and has been a pretty good pickup from Port as well.
Yeah.
And Mitchie's the other one as well. He sort of came on as a sub and got a bit of game time, and obviously being an ex-Freo boy, and fortunately hasn't had a good run with injuries, but he'd be interesting to see if he keeps his spot this week as well.
Yeah, certainly.
The other one will be obviously Jack Watts hasn't been able to sort of lacking a bit of confidence out there, so it'll be interesting to see what tactics Fremantle use on him to see if they can do it, because obviously once again they do have a Jeremy Howe has played back, but they've got a pretty reasonable size forwards with Chris Dawes is sort of starting to show a bit of the form he had played against when he was playing for Collingwood, and then obviously you've got the other forwards they have in there with Jesse Hogan, as you mentioned earlier. So they have got guys they can switch around a bit, and I thought McDonald showed a bit down back as well as a full back for him.
He's certainly probably one of the informed defenders out in the comp, probably with McFarlane and Rance, although Rance had a shocker last week. But Tom McDonald's been playing pretty well and probably one of Melbourne's best so far this season. So certainly going to be a job for them if they're looking at Pav and Clark, who's improved for us, and they're going to be stretched. And if we keep Taverner in the side, it's one way we can really test them out, because I'm not sure if too many taller types have come across Melbourne so far, but it's be a good run with the key forwards and their key backs.
Yeah, I mean, the other area that'll be interesting to see is they do have a pretty good batch of small forwards the rain probably helped them conditions on that, but Jeff Garlett seems to have shown a little bit in the last since coming across from Carlton. Kennedy Harris played okay, and as you said, you've got the likes of Jetta who can run through there as well. So obviously Sutcliffe will take one of those guys, but it'll be interesting to see how they who they play on the other small forward down there as well, whether you use Duffield down there or that sort of or whether they use Spur on them or something like that, whether they try and use a bit more physical player on Garlett, or whether they try and have someone who can run off him a bit as well.
When you look across that whole Melbourne list and names you just mentioned, you think with our more senior, bigger bodies that we'll have them measured there, and the only way that Melbourne can get through is probably on the counter or quick movement, and Garlett's one that's really improved that ball movement from Melbourne from the years gone past, because they were so slow and sort of fell into our hands when we defended well. But the way that they're playing better is guys like Jeff Garlett that's running the ball through.
Yeah, I think that's the other point. You mentioned earlier, Seppo, is the fact that the Demons have got those younger guys in there, and while it's going to be very hard. I mean, we can't really be saying anything about playing four-quarter footy at the moment, but you'd have to think that it'd be very hard for them to sustain that against a top. Not just us, but any sort of top four side at the moment for that four quarter. So they're going to have a bit of a lull in there, and it's just how effective Fremantle are going to be at taking advantage of that and getting the scoreboard pressure on like they did in the first half against Sydney on the weekend. All right. Any other points we want to bring up about the Melbourne game?
No, other than the fact there's going to be a Melbourne members pre-game function on that the club's emailed out, so make sure you check your emails if you haven't already. It's before the game, 10:30. Check the emails for details, and hopefully it's nice weather on Sunday and we actually get out there and put these Demons to the swords and get a big result for this game in Melbourne.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even though we sort of talk about it a little bit, the percentage is still going to be important, but at the end of the day, you just need to keep winning as well. But I don't think with the pressure for spots on at the moment that any player is going to be taking any games off at the moment, because they just know that if they do, there's one or two or three blokes ready there to take their spot. So I think everyone will be out doing the best, and and even our younger guys, guys with a little bit less experience are always standing up at the moment. So it's all good for the club at the moment, and good to see them also break through the 50,000 member barrier during the week, Seppo.
Yeah, it's good to see those big record numbers, and hopefully we see a bigger crowd there. I suppose with Melbourne being up and about, there's going to be a big crowd there, but I want to see now I've met some more Melbourne members over here and starting to get bigger numbers to these away games as well. Be great to see as well, and get more of a voice for the away games as well as the home games. Yeah,
I mean, even when I was there over at Geelong the other week, Seppo, it definitely seems to be a more numbers for the Fremantle supporters over there, and whether that's a bit of fife, whether they're getting new members or people travelling, but there definitely seems to be a greater numbers to our away games, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right, so what do you think any tips for this week, or what's your tip this week, Seppo?
Well, I'm going to go Freo by 35 points. I think that's something we can probably get through and not absolutely kill it, but I suppose like what we've seen so far, 4-quarter performance and a 35-point win will do me fine.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much. I was going to say about the 40-point mark, so I agree with you. I think it'll be about that. It'd be nice just to see Fremantle come out and play just a solid 4 quarters, and even if that's a case of winning by 2 goals every quarter, but rather than sort of coming. I mean, it's always nice to be able to sort of smash a team early and then sort of know the win's in the bag, but at the same time, you'd like to see 4 consistent quarters as well, and even if that's a case of winning by each quarter by 1 or 2, even a goal or 2 each quarter, rather than just sort of coming out and blitzing. But at the same time, you can't complain when you're 4-0. So I know there's a few naysayers and whatnot, but I'll take 4-0 at the start of the year any day of the week.
Definitely.
All right, thanks again for joining us for this sort of impromptu pod this week, Seppo. And as I said, we'll look forward to seeing the boys come out during the week and hopefully put on another great performance for us.
No worries. Thanks for organising this early recording, and enjoy your week off.
Thank you very much. It will be great to go on holidays. And thanks again for everyone else for listening. And just a reminder, others, send a message to myself or Seppo if you're interested in coming on. You just need a Skype account, and it's always great to have some different Big Footy members come on board. All right, we will speak to you all again in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.